My brother made my life unbearable for many years, and I later discovered a shocking truth that changed everything. He got my wife pregnant, and our son wasn't actually mine. After the fallout from that revelation, he now wants to reconnect with me following the disowning by our parents, which unexpectedly left me with their $2 million inheritance. This entire situation has left me feeling conflicted about our past and his recent attempts to reach out. Growing up, I had a younger brother named Caleb who have always harbored a deep-seated hatred towards me. Many might assume that this was rooted in jealousy, but that was far from the truth. Caleb was actually the favorite child in our family, receiving constant attention and affection from our mother. She would cook all his meals, do his laundry without question, and even urge me to help him with his schoolwork. While I was expected to lift him up, there was never any return of that support when I needed it most. Over the years, I learned to accept this imbalance in our relationship, becoming quite independent as a result. In hindsight, perhaps my willingness to accommodate Caleb's needs without any acknowledgement of my own played a role in our troubled relationship. I was the quiet, introverted child who preferred to stick to my studies and keep to myself, while he was loud and boisterous like our father. I often communicated directly, not one to sugarcoat my words, which may have contributed to my mother developing a negative view of me. Meanwhile, Caleb thrived as the family's golden child, which left me feeling isolated. The real troubles began when Caleb started to bully me for being different. He would make fun of my height and my glasses, and he even took it further by invading my personal space. He would sneak into my room, rummaging through my diary just to find something to complain to our mother about. Whenever I confronted him, I would voice my frustrations to our parents, but they merely laughed it off, telling me it was a trivial matter. The bullying escalated as he did more terrible things, like nearly breaking my glasses and adding stones to my cereal. Thankfully, I caught those stones before they caused any damage. But when I reported these incidents to my mom, she brushed them aside, insisting that this was simply how brothers bonded. Whenever we fought, he would deliberately target my insecurities, using them as weapons against me. Since we attended the same school, he was well aware that I was being bullied by other kids. Rather than standing up for me, he supported the bullies, encouraging them in their taunts, calling me names like ugly loser and hairy monkey. It became unbearable, especially when he once told me to kill myself during an argument. Those words cut deep because I was already struggling with my mental health at that time. Hearing my own brother wish for my death was devastating. Things progressed to a point where he tried to burn my hair while we were in high school. Surprisingly, our mother sided with him again, claiming he was just playing around. It seemed like our family dynamics were entirely skewed, with no one taking my pain seriously. Luckily, our father eventually intervened, recognizing that enough was enough. He confronted Caleb about his behavior and threatened to involve the police if he didn't change his ways. This was a defining moment for Caleb as it was the first time he faced any real consequences for his actions. My father came to talk to me afterward, expressing his surprise at the way things had unfolded. He had always pointed out how similar he was to Caleb, which made me skeptical about his support. But he assured me that he had been watching patiently for years, hoping Caleb would outgrow his immaturity. It was becoming clear to him that Caleb had crossed a line and was turning into a bully. This revelation was a turning point in our relationship, but it was too late to mend the wounds created over those many years. Now, with Caleb trying to re-enter my life after everything that has happened, I find myself torn between the past and the present. The inheritance from our parents complicates matters even further, as it brings up feelings I had buried long ago. When my dad spoke those words, I felt an overwhelming sense of validation wash over me. It was as if a heavy weight I had been carrying for years had been lifted. The emotions bubbled up inside me, and I nearly broke down in tears. In that moment of honesty, I found the courage to confess everything that Caleb had done to me throughout the years. Each instance of torment and every hurtful comment spilled out as I opened up about the bullying I faced at school. My dad listened intently, visibly shocked at the weight of my struggles and the pain I had endured in silence. The following day, my dad took immediate action to address the situation. He went to the principal's office and discussed the bullying I had experienced. He made it clear that my bullies needed to be warned about the serious consequences they would face if their behavior continued. That simple act of advocacy made me feel supported and valued in a way I hadn't felt before. Later that evening, my dad made the decision to enroll me in mixed martial arts at our local gym. He told me it was time for me to stand up for myself and learn how to confront the bullies in my life. I understood that seeing a nerdy kid like me trying to learn how to fight may have seemed funny to some, but I was determined. I've always been focused when it comes to learning something new. I carved out time in my busy schedule to ensure I could juggle my schoolwork while also dedicating time to my workouts and MMA classes. There was a noticeable change in my life and my physique, one I can reflect on with a sense of pride. One day, Caleb crossed the line again. He had stolen my pocket money, something I had saved up from doing chores around the house. I had worked hard to accumulate that money, and I felt particularly frustrated that he had sneaked into my room to take it. As I caught him about to ride off with his friends, I confronted him firmly, demanding he return the money he had stolen. However, he just laughed and taunted me, saying that all I ever did was run to our dad for help. It was in that moment that something inside me snapped. I don't know what came over me, but I delivered a powerful punch to his face. The look of shock on his face was priceless as he stumbled backward and fell to the ground. I quickly retrieved my money from his pocket and threw him back down, asserting my newfound confidence. His reactions were almost comical as he began to cry, sounding like a little kid rather than a teenager. At this point, my mother heard the commotion and rushed outside. Upon realizing what had happened, she was taken aback. She was surprised to see me standing my ground and initially scolded me for fighting with Caleb. Her expectations for an older brother were clear: I should teach him better. Caleb, relishing my mother's reprimand, looked pleased as she complained to my dad about how I had beaten him up and needed to be controlled. My dad, however, was not swift to take sides. He asked both of us to explain ourselves. I told my dad about the theft, emphasizing how hard I had worked for that money. Caleb, trying to turn the tables, claimed he needed the money for a date and insisted that as my brother, I should help him. My dad firmly told Caleb that he was lucky I didn't report him for stealing, as anyone else might have called the police. He explained to Caleb that taking things that don't belong to you is fundamentally wrong. Caleb didn't like my dad's response and began to throw a tantrum, hoping our mother would take his side. But Dad remained resolute. When Caleb realized that I wasn't going to get punished for standing up to him, he stormed off, shouting that he hated me before locking himself in his room. After that incident, a shift occurred between Caleb and me. He began to keep his distance, finally understanding that he could no longer bully me without facing consequences. Even though he refrained from physically harming me, he resorted to taunting me with cruel remarks when our parents weren't around. It was evident that as he got older, his behavior worsened. Each year seemed to fuel his anger and a shorter temper. If I ever approached him with a question, he would simply ignore me and walk away while muttering insults under his breath. Caleb also began to communicate with me only through our mother, who would relay his messages. When I asked her why he couldn't just talk to me directly if he needed something, she urged me to be more understanding of his behavior. I was left wondering if this was just a phase of puberty that would pass or if he genuinely harbored resentment towards me. Although I used to be able to brush off his taunts, it eventually became unbearable, and thoughts of moving out to escape the tension grew stronger. Time and time again, I would turn to my mother, expressing my desire to find a way to cope with my brother's actions. I frequently went to my mother, countless times, asking if she could help arrange a sit-down conversation where all of us could discuss our issues openly. Each time, she would refuse, insisting that she didn't want to get involved in family matters. I even sought her opinion on why Caleb treated me the way he did, hoping to understand his behavior better. Instead, she would brush off my questions, offering no real insight or comfort. Eventually, I left home to attend my dream university. I had always been a stellar student, maintaining excellent grades, and I even qualified for a scholarship. My dad was proud and threw a party to celebrate this achievement, and I could see that my mother shared in his pride. Despite this joyous occasion, Caleb remained distant and uninterested, hardly acknowledging my accomplishments. The day I left for university was filled with mixed emotions, excitement for the new chapter ahead and relief that I could escape the toxic environment I had lived in for so long. The first few months at the university were incredibly liberating. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and began building a life free from the oppressive atmosphere I had known while growing up. The constant fear of Caleb's verbal attacks faded away, replaced by a newfound sense of peace and safety. During my second year at university, I met my wife, Karen. We were introduced by a mutual friend at a fraternity party, and we connected immediately. Coming from a religious family, we knew that having children without being married was considered wrong. However, during our last year, we found out Karen was pregnant, which led us to marry shortly after graduation. Our wedding was small but filled with love, and our parents were happy for us as we celebrated our union. At that moment, I believed that Karen was the love of my life. I had always envisioned a future of monogamy, wanting one partner to share my life with for the long haul. Even when other women showed interest over the years, I never pursued anything outside my marriage because I was genuinely happy with Karen. She truly felt like my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. However, as time went on, I discovered that she had been unfaithful on 2 separate occasions. The first was an on-and-off affair that lasted a few years involving her married co-worker, and the second was a brief fling with an ex-boyfriend she encountered during a family visit states away. I know some people might think I was foolish for forgiving her, and I can't deny that looking back, it may have seemed naive. After each incident, we spent a period apart, but I ultimately chose to forgive my wife. I didn't want our child to grow up in a broken home, and I genuinely believed we could work through our challenges. At the time, we were both quite young, so I chalked her actions up to youthful mistakes and poor choices. For a while, it seemed like we were doing okay. Although I could never fully trust her again, I tried my best to set aside my doubts, knowing that if I chose to forgive her, I had to commit to moving on and starting fresh. For years passed since the last incident of infidelity, and I felt validated in my decision to give her another chance. Karen appeared to have changed, and we were genuinely happy, making plans for our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my world was once again shattered by another revelation. She confessed that she had been sleeping with someone else for a considerable time and even suggested that our son might not be mine. The moment I heard those words, I felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under me. A wave of shock, betrayal, and disbelief washed over me, and I struggled to grasp the enormity of what she had just revealed. In the days that followed, I sought answers from Karen, pressing her to explain why she had kept such a monumental secret and how she could have done something so devastating to our relationship. Her reaction was chilling. She maintained a cold and indifferent demeanor, appearing almost detached from the pain she had caused me. Her responses to my questions were vague and unhelpful, leaving me with more confusion than clarity. It was a surreal and heartbreaking moment, confronting the ruins of my trust and the unsettling uncertainties surrounding my own family. I continued to ask Karen for the truth, feeling an overwhelming need for clarity in the midst of my shattered reality. I felt I deserved to know who the father of the child was, especially since I had been involved in raising our son from the very beginning. After some time, Karen finally admitted that Caleb was the father. My eyes widened in shock as I processed her words and asked her what she meant by that. Karen explained how she and Caleb had begun their friendship when I introduced her to my family during Thanksgiving, and she stayed with us until after the new year. I could recall how Caleb, who usually kept his distance from me, acted politely and warmly towards her. I was relieved because I wanted Karen to feel welcomed and accepted in my family. During her stay, Karen spent a lot of time with my mother, wanting to fit in with us. She noticed that Caleb and I were not very close, which led her to ask me about our relationship. I finally decided to open up to her about my complicated history with Caleb, sharing how our bond had been strained for many years and that it seemed unlikely we could ever repair it. Karen listened and understood my feelings, but took it upon herself to include Caleb in our outings, perhaps with the hope that the three of us could grow closer. Whenever we went out to watch a movie, Karen would insist on inviting Caleb along, often leading us to watch his choice of film. Gradually, Caleb and I exchanged a few words here and there, which was a big change from the years he had given me the silent treatment. I also noticed that Karen and Caleb would hang out together, playing video games, but I never gave it much thought at the time. Then Karen revealed to me that one day, Caleb had shared his struggles and feelings with her, particularly regarding a recent breakup with his ex-girlfriend. In that moment of vulnerability, they formed a connection. Karen described how Caleb would sometimes flirt with her while I was not around, and eventually, one thing led to another. I closed my eyes as the disturbing image of my wife and brother together made my stomach turn. Karen expressed how guilty she felt after their encounter and told me that she had decided to distance herself from Caleb. She went back home, which resonated with my own experience when my girlfriend had unexpectedly chosen to return home right when I thought she would celebrate New Year's with me. I tried to persuade her to stay, but she insisted she had to leave. When classes resumed at college, Karen was back to her cheerful self, and I never suspected anything was amiss. Then, just a couple of weeks later, we found out that Karen was pregnant. She confessed that she didn't know if the baby was mine or Caleb's, and without any way to prove it, she chose to stay with me because she saw me as the more reliable brother. This is what led us to get married. As the reality settled in, I felt as if my whole world was crumbling. The child I had cherished and spent so many moments with might not even be mine. I confronted Karen, questioning whether she was still involved with Caleb, and she nodded slowly in reply. She went on to explain that they had kept in touch and that their chemistry was undeniable. Often, when she claimed to be working late, she would actually be sneaking off to hotels with him. She admitted that many of her business trips were not for work at all, but rather romantic getaways with Caleb. Feeling overwhelmed, I asked Karen why she would even marry me if she truly wanted a relationship with my brother. She responded by saying she didn't want to be the one to end our marriage. She saw how great I was as a father and how much I loved our son, and this was part of why she stayed with me. In her eyes, she had made a mistake but didn't know when to stop. I simply told her that I appreciated her honesty and that I was going to gather my things and leave. Karen began to cry, pleading for my forgiveness. She expressed that she expected me to be angry and yell, but here I was, calmly considering my next steps. I walked over to my cupboard and started putting my clothes into a suitcase. As I packed, Karen urged me to fight for her, saying that mistakes happen and that love was worth saving. Mistakes are a part of every marriage. I remember a time when my wife, Karen, faced a harsh reality. I was not going to change my mind about ending our relationship. Instead of trying to convince me with logic, she shifted her approach. Karen began to discuss our son and how devastating a divorce would be for him. She spoke passionately about the importance of raising children in a stable home, insisting that a broken family would harm his development. In response, I reminded her of a painful truth: there was a chance I might not even be his biological father. This comment struck her hard, and she fell into tears, beginning to raise her voice in anger. She accused me of being cruel, pointing out that I had been by our son's side since the day he was born. It was clear to me that Karen believed I would never want to leave our marriage, and in part, I had allowed this belief to grow by ignoring many of her past actions. While I had some love for her, it felt complicated. This love seemed to come less from a deep connection and more from the history we shared, dating back to our college days and the bond of having a son together. Karen continued to assert that it was not too late for us to fix our problems, but deep down, I found it hard to trust her words. I felt exhausted by the situation and inadequately patient to navigate the complexities of our relationship. Trust had become a significant issue. Even if I chose to forgive her for her past mistakes, I could never erase the memory of her affair with my own brother, Caleb. I had always believed in the possibility of forgiveness because everyone makes mistakes, but this particular betrayal crossed a line that was hard for me to accept. After leaving Karen sobbing on the doorstep, I found refuge in a hotel for the night. The following day, I sought comfort from my parents and told them everything about the affair that had been hidden for so long. I revealed how Karen and Caleb had been deceiving me for years. The shock on their faces was unmistakable. My mother, however, initially struggled to accept the truth. In her protective nature, she tried to defend Caleb, claiming he could never hurt me like that. I wanted to reveal the truth without any doubt in their minds, and so I insisted that they remain quiet while I called Caleb in front of them. I aimed to catch him off guard, allowing him to let his guard down during the call. When Caleb answered, I confronted him directly about the affair. At first, he denied everything with great fervor, refusing to acknowledge the truth. When I explained that Karen had confessed to the whole situation, he quickly shifted his blame onto her, calling her characterless. He argued that he could not help it if women found him attractive, boasting about being the better-looking brother. I stood firm, stating that I would expose him for what he had done. Caleb responded with mockery, claiming that everyone would believe he was the golden child, and that my accusations were baseless. In that moment of arrogance, I thanked him for confirming my allegations, knowing that our parents had heard the whole exchange. The tone shifted, Caleb fell silent, realizing the gravity of his situation. My mother, still in disbelief, pressed him for an explanation. He stuttered through a feeble attempt to justify his actions, casting blame on everyone and anything other than himself. Watching my mother, once so protective of him, I could see her emotions shift to disappointment and anger. In that charged moment, I felt a sense of vindication. For years, I had endured Caleb's torment, and now the tables had turned. He was the one exposed, his deceit laid bare. As his defenses crumbled, my father, who usually kept his feelings hidden, could not contain his disappointment any longer. He asked me for the phone, his voice heavy with disapproval. He addressed Caleb directly, stating that what he had done was not only a betrayal to me but also a deep betrayal to our family. He stressed that Caleb had crossed a line by sleeping with my wife, especially after we were married. My father's words made it clear that Caleb's actions had consequences, ones that would forever damage the trust we once had in him. He reminded Caleb of the values of family loyalty and decency, the very principles he had tried to instill in both of us. After a moment of silence, the weight of those words hung heavy in the air, making it clear that the family would never be the same again. The weight of my father's words hung heavily in the air, settling firmly on Caleb's conscience. He had blatantly disregarded our brother's feelings, showing a complete lack of respect for the sacred nature of his marriage. This behavior was simply unacceptable. Not only had he inflicted pain on our brother, but he had also tarnished the bonds that hold our family together. My father expressed his sorrow, feeling that he and my mother were partly to blame for the person Caleb had become. He firmly declared that they would no longer allow Caleb to continue with such disrespectful behavior. From that moment on, my father announced a significant change: he would be cutting Caleb off from the college funds he had set up for him. Caleb would have to find a way to manage his own university fees, and he would no longer receive financial support for his lifestyle. My father questioned the misguided notion that sleeping with married women made Caleb more of a man. Now, he would see what it meant to face the consequences of his actions without our family's financial support. Throughout this confrontation, I maintained a calm demeanor, despite my initial desire to scream at Caleb. Watching my father hold Caleb accountable was a moment of ultimate vindication for me. I had successfully exposed Caleb's true nature, and it was evident that he had underestimated the severity of his actions. As Caleb continued to protest and justify what he had done, my father swiftly ended the phone call, effectively shutting down Caleb's attempts to explain himself. My mother approached me and enveloped me in a warm hug. It had been a while since we had shared such a moment, and in that embrace, a deep, unspoken understanding and sense of support blossomed between us amid the family turmoil. She apologized for not believing me all this time, and I felt a rush of emotions. In that moment, I realized that my younger self, just 14 years old, never would have imagined experiencing such validation and comfort from my mother. Afterward, my father assisted me in finding a competent lawyer so that I could initiate my divorce from Karen. During the process, Karen and her lawyer attempted to play dirty by demanding alimony, arguing that I earned more than she did. Fortunately, her affair worked significantly in my favor during the proceedings. We also arranged for a paternity test for my son, which confirmed that Caleb was indeed the child's father. The pain of receiving that news was unbearable. It was worse than the moment Karen had told me about her cheating. A wave of anger washed over me as the reality sank in that my son wasn't truly mine. Despite the heartbreak, I reminded myself that sometimes God works in mysterious ways. I decided to stay strong through this turbulent period. Karen pleaded with me to continue visiting our son, insisting that he should not suffer because of the mistakes made by the adults in his life. However, I found it too difficult to see him, as he reminded me too much of Caleb, and my feelings of resentment were too strong to overcome. Once my divorce was finalized, I finally felt a sense of freedom. I moved into my own bachelor pad, and the experience felt surreal. Having gotten married so young, I had never truly lived alone before. Thankfully, I was accustomed to being independent, so I quickly adapted to my new bachelor lifestyle, and I genuinely enjoyed it. Just 2 weeks ago, my father called to tell me that he was considering changing his will because he wanted to ensure that Caleb would not inherit anything from him. Everyone knew my father to be someone who was extremely set in his ways. He had made the decision that he wanted nothing to do with Caleb, and he was determined to stick to it. Despite Caleb's attempts to reach out to our parents, even showing up at their doorstep to beg for forgiveness, he was not allowed inside their home. My mother, who typically gave in to Caleb's tantrums, also seemed to have reached her limit, although it was likely causing her significant pain. Throughout all this chaos, Caleb never once sent me a text to apologize for his actions, showing that he harbored no remorse. His only concern appeared to be the loss of our parents' support. My father informed me that he planned to leave everything he owned to me, ensuring that Caleb would receive only a single dollar. I was taken aback by the magnitude of my father's decision, knowing he had worked diligently throughout his life, building his assets, retirement funds, and life insurance policies, which amounted to nearly $2 million. The only condition in his will stated that if my father passed away before my mother, she would maintain residence in their home, even though the ownership would legally belong to me. I had no objections to this arrangement, as I intended to take care of my mother for the rest of her days. Caleb somehow found out about everything that had been happening between us. Since he couldn't get in touch with our parents, he called me yesterday, trying to fix things. He opened up about the struggles he was facing in college. He mentioned that after Karen learned about the paternity of the child, she had been constantly bothering him for child support. Caleb explained that he had no money and was desperately seeking part-time jobs but was unable to find anything suitable. In a moment of vulnerability, he begged me to talk to our family so we could start fresh, emphasizing how much he needed my help. At that moment, I couldn't hold back my laughter. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him that I was finished with him. I reminded him that he should have considered the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. Caleb tried to argue back, claiming I was being unfair and insisting that Karen was also to blame. I had to agree with him partially, but I quickly reminded him that I had already divorced her. She was now his responsibility, not mine. He should not be calling me with complaints about her or the child since those were the results of his own choices. As Caleb's voice began to rise in frustration, I interrupted him, making it clear that he was no longer the favored child in our family. Instead, he had become the black sheep who betrayed his brother by sleeping with my wife. At this point, I watched him break down in tears, sharing that everyone, including our grandparents and other relatives, had been putting pressure on him. While I recognized that this was true, it was no longer my concern. I stood firm in my decision, telling him that our relationship was over and that he should never call me again. From that moment on, I felt as though I had lost my brother. Since then, I have been replaying that conversation over and over in my mind. It's strange how much anger I felt towards him, yet hearing him cry affected me deeply. It was a reminder of the brother I used to know, the one I hadn't heard cry since we were kids. Although it hurt me to see him so helpless, I found myself questioning whether I should inform our parents about what was happening with him. I weighed the possibility that if I stayed silent, I might be in the wrong for not updating them on his situation. Now, let me shift gears for a moment. Many people have been asking me why I no longer have contact with my son, Henry. Some have even called me cruel for my actions. The truth is that I don't feel comfortable raising another man's child. This situation is not your typical stepson scenario. Initially, I was led to believe that Henry was my son. When I discovered he was actually my brother Caleb's child, it shattered me. I have been hurt and cried for days over this realization. My reluctance to maintain any contact with Henry stems from my desire to cut all ties with Karen. I fear that if I engage with her child, she will find a way to reinsert herself into my life. I need my space. You might label me as cruel or selfish, but I believe that I cannot see him again, at least not for a long while. Now for an update, many of you have correctly guessed that it was actually my mother who informed Caleb about my dad changing his will. This prompted Caleb to call me as a last resort to mend things. I confronted her in front of my dad, and she broke down in tears. She pleaded with me, saying that I had punished Caleb enough and that he had learned his lesson. My dad, however, stood firm and told my mother that if she believed Caleb's actions were forgivable, he could no longer remain married to her. He expressed that he would never forgive Caleb for his betrayal. This seemed to silence her. My dad made it clear that if she ever spoke to Caleb again and we found out, she could leave him. My dad is very stubborn, and I hope my mother learns from this experience. It has been 5 months since my last update, and my relationship with my parents has improved significantly during this time. My dad and I now go golfing every weekend, and he treats me more like a friend rather than just his son. While my mother still misses Caleb, she has stayed away from him. The last I heard from my cousin was about Caleb asking for money from everyone. In the end, he had to drop out of college because he couldn't pay his fees anymore. Caleb and Karen are now living together, and I understand that he has found work as a part-time mechanic. Apparently, they are raising Henry together, which I suppose is a good thing. I have made it a point never to bring up Caleb in conversations with my parents, and they have not mentioned him either. In conversations with my parents, I make a point to avoid mentioning Caleb. This is a mutual understanding, they do not bring him up either. It seems that everyone around us is asking how I am doing. I want to assure them that I am doing quite well, in fact. 2 months ago, I received a promotion at my job, which means my salary has improved quite a bit. This positive change in my career has brought me some comfort and a sense of achievement. However, on the personal front, I have not been dating anyone recently. I think it is important for me to take the time I need to heal and not rush into new relationships just yet. I feel that this time alone is necessary for my growth. To assist me in this process, I have started attending a few therapy classes. These sessions are dedicated to helping me understand my feelings better and work through what I have experienced. I am hopeful that with time and effort, I will see positive results from this journey.